Okay, this is the third video in the Human Evolution series for grade 12s. Today we're going to talk about human ancestry. Where exactly do we come from? We know from the fossil evidence that there are a number of Homo species. If we ignore our ancestry in terms of do we come from gorillas or chimpanzees or other things, which hopefully we've answered in the previous video, we know that there are a number of Homo species. Homo sapiens sapiens, that's us, we are not the only species of human being to have walked this planet. These three models are artists' impressions based on fossils that have been found of three different Homo species. Homo habilis on the left, known as handyman, simply because the fossils were found with tools and it was evident that the individuals from that species were able to use their hands to make tools. Homo erectus on the right, so called because it was the first fossil that was found that showed very clear evidence of bipedalism. Not that Homo erectus was the first one to walk upright. Australopithecus was the first genus in which there were species that walked upright, or at least were partially bipedal. Homo rudolfensis in the middle, there's some debate about whether that is an actual species or whether it's a subspecies of others, but nevertheless. So those are artists' impressions of what the other hominid species looks like. Just to reiterate, did we evolve from chimps? No, we did not evolve from chimps. Did we evolve from baboons or not baboons, from gorillas? No, we did not. We share a common ancestor with them. They are not evolved from us, we are not evolved from them, but we do share in our history a common ancestor. So again, just to recap, if we have a look here, over on the right, all the human species, we share a common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos, who share about 99% of our DNA. We share a more distant common ancestor with gorillas, a more distant common ancestor with orangutans, and a more distant ancestor with the lesser apes. Okay, so the common ancestor evolved certainly for chimps and human beings. That evolved about between 8 and 6 million years ago. I've shown this image before, or something like it. This image is taken from the Smithsonian Institute, for which I'm grateful for their making stuff public. The evolution of human beings is not a direct lineage. It's not like on your family tree you can draw a direct line from you to your father, to your grandfather, to your great-grandfather, to your great-great-great-grandfather, etc. It's more of what we call a bushy tree. And the reason for this is that we don't quite know, or we haven't yet found, all of the missing links between each of the different species. We are still trying to figure out what the ancestry is for Homo sapiens. We're not entirely sure. There are hints and clues as to how we evolved, but nothing is 100% certain. So if you have a look at this tree, you can see down the bottom, Ardipithecus. Ardipithecus is the first hominid-like species. Then we've got Australopithecus over on the left. We've got Paranthropus over on the right, and we are very clear that Paranthropus actually are not a direct ancestor for the Homo genus. They are related. We come from the same root. We have a common ancestor, but they're a side branch entirely. They're not in our direct line. And then there's us, the Homo group, the genus Homo, up at the top. I would highly recommend, if you have data and you're able to, that you actually go to the website down the bottom of the page there, humanorigins.si.edu, and go and roll over on each of these different images and learn more about each of these different groups. This is the fossil record as we have it, as it stands at the moment. The black parts of any of those skulls are the missing bits. We don't have those bits of the skull, but the white bits are the actual bones that we've got. You can see here that Homo sapiens, over on this side over here, okay, remember when you read this thing, this is millions of years ago, 0 millions of years ago means now, 1 million years ago, 2 million years ago, 3 million years ago, 4 million years ago. So this is the distant past all the way through to current time now. And you can see that Homo sapiens, we obviously exist now, have existed for about 20,000 years. Okay, at the same time that for about 200,000 years. At the same time that we've existed, Homo neanderthalensis has also existed. It's only this last 20,000 years that we've actually been the only species of human being on the planet. So we existed at the same time as Homo neanderthalensis. We know that because when we look at DNA in the Neanderthal genes, and we look at DNA in the human being genes, we have about 4% of our DNA actually comes from Homo neanderthalensis. So there was interbreeding between the two species. They existed at the same time. In fact, blonde hair and blue eyes is a neanderthalensis version of the gene for hair color and eye color, or versions of the gene, because it's not a single gene, it's a polygenic trait, hair color and eye color. And so those genes relating to hair color and eye color actually come from Neanderthals. They're not a Homo sapiens pure gene. All right, notice that there's also some overlap with Homo heidelbergensis. Notice this long period in which Homo erectus was present on the planet. Homo erectus is probably the most successful species of human being to have existed, and they've been around, or they were around for a significantly long period of time. Why is it then that we are the only ones that have survived? Okay. That's a question for you to ponder. Why is it that Homo sapiens have been successful at getting rid of or eliminating all of the competition? Notice that Homo erectus did overlap with Homo sapiens. Okay, Homo heidelbergensis appears to have disappeared at around the time that we appeared, but certainly Homo erectus and Neanderthalensis, they were both around at the same time that we were. Okay, going back into the distant past, here you can see some other Homo species, Hamulus rudolfensis ergaster, Australopithecus sediba. Some of you may have been aware about a decade ago of this discovery by an 8-year-old boy. His father is a paleontologist working up at the Cradle of Mankind in Pretoria area, between Pretoria and Joburg. And sediba was a new species of hominid that was found by this 8-year-old boy. It had been washed, we think, into a cave below ground, and had not been, we think that what happened is that an injured individual or a couple of injured individuals were swept into a cave during a flood and were not able to climb out of the cave and then died in the cave. Possibly. They might have been buried there, we're not entirely sure. Okay, moving on. Australopithecus. Notice all these different species of Australopithecus. There are lots of different Australopithecus species here. Okay, in the same way with Homo, there are a lot of different Homo species. Homo naledi, that's an even more recent discovery. This bar, in terms of how long it existed, there is evidence to support this, but at this stage it's still quite fresh evidence. So it's still under debate as to whether some of the fossils that have been found at either end are actually Homo naledi or whether they are belonging to one of these other species. So that's still under debate. I show you this simply to point out the fact that when people talk about human evolution, they are talking specifically about Homo sapiens. And what you have to realize is that we are not alone. We are not a finished product. We are still in the process of undergoing natural selection and undergoing evolution, but we are also not alone. Okay? We are not the only species of human being that has ever existed. We are just the only species of human being that exists currently. And unfortunately, we are very self-absorbed as a species, and so we think the entire world revolves around us and us alone, and that we are the pinnacle of creation. We may well be, if you are a person of faith, we may well be the pinnacle of God's creation. However, we are called to be stewards of the earth. We are not called to lord it over the earth. So this self-centered approach is purely because we are the only species of human being that is currently alive, but we are not the only species of human being that has ever been alive. Okay, all of these things, all of these species here, these are all considered to be humans or hominids. All right, a different version of that same kind of graph. This one is based on DNA evidence. You can see there goes the gorilla tribe. Okay. There goes the chimpanzees and the bonobos. And there goes Australopithecus. Here's Ardipithecus. So there goes Australopithecus. And coming out of Australopithecus, there we are. So you can see quite clearly that we are not evolved from chimpanzees, because this is chimpanzee here. This is not chimpanzee over here. Right? This is the chimpanzee ancestor. This is the chimpanzee. This is the gorilla. This is the gorilla ancestor. There's human beings. There is our human ancestor. There is Australopithecus, who is also one of our ancestors. In this portion over here, This is where speciation is taking place. This is where the original ancestor, which is from the red, starts diverging into Australopithecus and Pan. Throughout this period here, there was interbreeding between the two species, okay, or between the two genera rather. And that interbreeding occurred because speciation was still in the process of occurring. We can only really say that speciation had occurred around this point here, which is around maybe 5 million years ago. At that point, if an individual of Australopithecus and an individual of Pan had tried to mate, they would not have been able to do so because of reproductive isolating mechanisms. Possibly also geographical, but definitely if they were in the same region, there would have been isolating mechanisms that prevented reproduction. But in this period here, a period of nearly 2 million years, there was interbreeding between those two groups, or between the two evolving groups. Okay, so speciation is not something, macroevolution is not something that occurs overnight in an instant. It occurs over a long period of time. In our case, 2 million years is what separated from the time that we became two completely different genera to the time that we were only one species or only one genus. So I wanted to just point that out to you. Okay, so we are not evolved from chimps. Chimps are here. We are here. We are not evolved from chimps. Chimps are not evolved from us. We are not evolved from gorillas. Gorillas are not evolved from us. But we do share a common ancestor way back about 8 million years ago. Another version, and all of these different versions occur because people are in the process still of finding missing links, of doing research, of looking at DNA, of trying to understand how our ancestry works. So what we can say quite clearly, there was an Ardipithecus species from which we evolved. There have been various Australopithecine species in our history, and there have been a number of different Homo species in our genus: Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis. Those are probably the three most important, and that we are not the pinnacle of all evolution and creation. We are not a finished product. We are just one more species of Homo that exists on the planet today. When we're looking at the fossil evidence, you will need to be able to talk about the major groups in our history. So Australopithecus, the Taung child. This is a child's skeleton that was found in Taung in South Africa in 1924 by Raymond Dart. So you need to know that the Taung child fossil is an Australopithecine, that it was discovered in 1924 by Raymond Dart in South Africa. Mrs. Ples. Mrs. Ples is actually a male, not a female. It was misdiagnosed initially, but we've stuck with the name Mrs. Ples because that's how it was popularized. Mrs. Ples is also an Australopithecine, was found by Raymond, is it also Raymond Broom? Can't think of his first name now, in the 1930s, in the Sterkfontein Caves. The Sterkfontein Caves form part of the Cradle of Mankind up near Johannesburg, Pretoria area. Okay, yet another version of our ancestry. So here we are at this end over here, and we're not sure whether we evolved from Heidelbergensis or from Homo erectus or from Homo agaster, who there's also some debate about whether agaster is actually a separate species or is actually part of Homo erectus, was just misdiagnosed. Notice here, Rudolfensis. As I said to you, there is some question as to whether Rudolfensis is actually a separate species or whether Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis are actually the same species. These questions will be answered as we find more fossils. I've said to you in a previous video that there is more fossil evidence that has been discovered, certainly around human beings, in the last 20 or 30 years than probably in the entire history of paleontology before that. And the reason for that is that there are more paleontologists now, more archaeologists now. There is more funding available now for people to go and do digs and to find fossils. So I have no doubt that in time to come, we will find these missing links in between that will give us clearer answers in terms of where we come from, exactly what our ancestry actually is. All right, let's look at some of the Homo species. Homo erectus. you can see the pronounced brow ridges, so that's still a feature that the great apes shared, but the brain case is much bigger, okay, very close to ours in some cases, 1,250 cubic centimeters. The legs and the hips are fairly modern, but very bipedal, but there's an odd shoulder joint, okay, which is still a leftover, if you like, from our ancestor. Called Homo erectus, called so because of being bipedal. Typical tools used, I'm sure you've seen these from the Stone Age. This is an axe or an adze. What's interesting is that although Homo habilis is the first evidence of tool use, Homo erectus developed that tool use further. All right, yet another phylogeny or phylogenetic tree, as the department wants you to call it. You don't need to know this. This is purely to try and explain to you how it is that we have evolved. So right down the bottom here, there are the chimpanzees and the bonobos. Ardipithecus, there is some debate about Ardipithecus and whether Ardipithecus is actually in the chimpanzee line or not, this particular species, Kadaba. You don't really need to concern yourself with that at this point. Australopithecus afarensis means southern ape. Australopithecus afarensis found in Kenya, in the eastern part of Africa. Australopithecus africanus was the first one found on African soil. As I said, you don't really need to know about Paranthropus at all. And every time speciation occurs and new species appear, we think that Australopithecus, that the first Australopithecus that was actually classified as a Homo is Homo habilis. There is some question around that. Then we've got Ergaster, which split off from us. Then we've got Erectus, Homo erectus, that split off from us. Then we've got some very interesting branches off here. The Denisovans. It's worth going and doing a little bit of research about the Denisovans. They're a very, very interesting group, highly isolated from the rest of the Homo species, and developed some quite interesting features. It appears that we have some Denisovan DNA in us as well, but that's a very, very interesting group. So you might want to go and look at that. Neanderthalensis, with whom we did interbreed. And finally, we are on a line of our own, speciation occurring here. Homo sapiens, human beings. That's the modern human being. Homo sapiens sapiens, the wise man.